Hi guys, welcome to part 6 of this Serum overview. In this section of the tutorial course, we are going to be discussing the envelopes and the LFOs inside of Serum. So you'll notice that no matter what page you are on inside the synth, you'll always be able to see them. So envelope 1 is the envelope that is tied to the output of Serum. And by that I mean if we go into envelope 2 and start to mess with the attack and the sustain and now play a note, it has zero effect on the sound. Envelope 1 inversely will, so this will have more attack. So if you just want to start messing around with the actual envelope of your sound, you're going to be using envelope 1. That means envelope 2 and 3 are there for you to modulate your sounds with, because modulation inside of Serum is very important to get really cool big sounds. Going back to envelope 1, when you click on these tabs, you'll notice that you'll see the visual graphical interface for it. So when you click on envelope 2, it's a slightly different shape, and envelope 3, it's a different shape. So when you click on envelope 1, you will just be looking at envelope 1. When you click on envelope 2, do you see this little grayed out section here? Well, that's showing you what's going on with your first envelope, and the same will go for your third envelope as well. So this little crosshair right here, when you click on any of these envelopes, this means that if you click and drag this, it'll make a connection with another section of the synth. And we're going to talk about actually modulating in depth in a little bit in another part of the tutorial course. But that's what that little symbol is. And you'll notice right when I make the connection, it now says 1. If I take envelope 1 and make another connection to another part of the synth, it'll say 2. And it'll keep on counting up. So that's a really nice visual way of being able to see where you are placing your envelopes, or any modulator for that instance. So you can obviously move and shape your envelopes with the controls here, the attack, the hold, the decay, the sustain, the release, or you can do it in the grid if you so choose. Now, I've been messing around with it, and I don't think there's a big difference between the two. I think it's just a flavor thing. Whichever you're most comfortable doing, you can do. It's not going to be something that you're going to be hard pressed to get certain results with using the grid as opposed to the controls down below. Let's actually talk about these controls. For anyone who's an absolute noob, I will give you a crash course on attack, decay, sustain, release. So that's what ADSR stands for on the synth. Hopefully all of you know that, are on the actual website and everything. ADSR sounds, it's, harkening back to attack, decay, sustain, release. The attack is this section here. And if I move this out, you'll see the attack is the time it takes for your signal to reach its peak amplitude. And Serum shows this visually really nice. So, see that little blue blip moving along the line? The attack is going to take 1.16 seconds at this setting to reach its peak amplitude. And then the hold is going to be how long it holds that peak amplitude for. So right now the hold is going to be, we'll do about a second. Call it a day on that. So it's going to take 1.16 seconds to reach the peak, and it's going to hold that for 1.1 or 1.07 seconds before it starts to dip down into the decay. All right, the decay is this section of the curve where the sound is starting to lose energy and volume, and it's going down into your sustain level. Now the sustain is how long the note or the signal is going to ring out. And finally, the release is how long after you let up on a note or the trigger is turned off, you'll still hear the sound. Let me turn the attack down. So you can see I'm just clicking really sharp, short notes, and you still hear the sound ringing out. That is because of the release. Now, cool tip and trick with that release function. If you have a sound that's a bunch of unison stacks and you're maybe using oscillator A and B at the same time, and it's getting kind of CPU heavy, make sure your release times on this, definitely on this first envelope, but as well as your modulated sources, they're not longer than they have to be, because it will turn off CPU cycles when the note is not ringing out. So it's a good way to conserve your CPU. If you want to use these controls to fiddle with your envelopes in Serum, if you notice if I start to just move this up, it goes quite quickly from 0 milliseconds all the way up to 32 seconds. Well, if you want more precise edits, you can hold down Shift on your keyboard and start to move, and you'll see that it's now going up by just 0.1 every time I move it. So if you need something very precise, you can do it that way. That will hold true for all the knobs, pretty much all the knobs in Serum. If you need a more precise value, you can hold down Shift, and it will let you scroll at a much more precise and slower rate. Okay, so let's say you make an edit to it and you want to go back to the default or any other setting. If you command click on any knob, it'll go back to its default setting, which is nice if you start to do things that mess up. So if you just go through all these knobs and hit command click on all of them, or alt click, I believe, if you're on a PC, this is the default envelope shape now. Okay, let's look at these controls over to the right of the grid view on the envelopes, or in the envelope section. So every envelope will have the same controls. And the first thing you see, it looks like a little lock symbol, or a padlock, and that's what it is. And what it does is it will automatically zoom your envelope to fit this whole grid view. So if I go to envelope 1 and click this off, and I'll make a different shape here. Let's make a really tiny shape, then hit this. It'll zoom from the tip of the beginning to the end. It'll actually zoom and fill your whole thing. So that's helpful if you are done editing or you want to see things in a little bit of a bigger scale. Then finally, you have this magnifying glass and these two little sliding arrows. This is where you can zoom in on your envelope. So let's say you want to create a really long envelope and you want to be able to see how many seconds it's going out for, because you have the seconds down here where it says 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and so forth. So that's how you can be able to see the whole envelope or make your edits to it as you need. And that pretty much sums up the controls inside of the envelope section. They're pretty straightforward. Nothing too crazy, especially if you come from using Massive Ever. Very, very similar layout, look and feel, especially with these connecting points that you can modulate with. So let's go on now to the LFOs. Now you get 4 of them, and by default they're each going to be on this shape. So again, it's the same thing as the envelopes, where if you click on one, you'll see the connecting symbol and you'll see this little half or 3/4 circle. And this symbol means you can connect it to destinations in the synth. And the same thing applies where you have this number that will keep counting up the more connections I make. Now let's say you start making connections and you want to remove them all at the same time. You can right click or control click on a Mac on this little downward facing arrow and hit remove all destinations, and now it's back to 0. And everything's back to brand new. So as with the envelopes where you have the grid view and the knobs, same applies to the LFOs. You can edit your LFOs in the grid. You can double click to add new points. You can alt click to do some stuff where it kind of snaps it to a grid as you move it around. There's a bunch that you can do. You can hold down shift and it will make it move like a step sequencer. So there's just a bunch of stuff you can do. So let me actually apply this to a sound so we can start to hear it. So to do that, you have to make a connecting point. So I am going to apply this to the wavetable position. But I need a wavetable that actually has information, because remember, this oscillator by default is going to be a 1 cycle or 1 frame wavetable, so there's nothing really to move to. So let's load up a spectral table. And now we have a bunch of information, so this LFO will start to do something. So it's scanning in back and forth between the different frames in that wavetable, which is pretty cool and actually a really useful tip for doing dubstep wobbles and growls. So let's start to talk about these different controls in the envelopes. Right now we have this step sequencer-ish type of LFO going. It's pretty crazy. Well, let's go down to this section over here. You'll see the first thing is a folder, and this is where you can actually load up presets. So here's a sidechain, which is really cool. So you can load up different shapes. There's miscellaneous ones, like crazy ones like this, which will be weird. All right, and then you can save your own. If you want to save, like I have a growl shape I've saved actually a few. They're just not all in the folder for the tutorial. And then here's where you can change the depth of your grid. You can go all the way up to 16. And you can go over to the right. You'll see these controls where it'll say trigger, envelope, and off. Well, on trigger, what this will do is, let's listen real quick. When it's on trigger and you keep holding down a key, you can see I'm holding down C over here, it will just keep looping for as long as you hold it. You'll keep looping your LFO wherever it's modulating. So I can modulate this to the phase. I can do a host of things, and it will just keep going. Now if we unclick this and or not unclick, but go to envelope, turn it to envelope. Now we hold it. You'll see that it stopped repeating. So this makes your LFO act like an envelope. So even though Serum technically only has 3 envelopes, the LFOs can all act like envelopes by choosing the envelope trigger mode. Now off, we'll just have both of these settings off. And then you have over here to the right, you have BPM. This will sync the rate knob to your host tempo and it'll display the rate in a musical value, like an eighth note, a quarter note, and so forth. If you uncheck it, it'll display in hertz. So for more sound design, kind of out there sounds, it might be helpful to see it in hertz. And then you have this LFO anchor. This will determine basically the playhead. It'll anchor it to when you start on a downbeat in your DAW or whatever, it'll start it from the beginning of the LFO shape. All right, and then below here you have triplets, so you can engage your triplets on the rate. If you have that unchecked, you won't see the triplets. See here. So if you want to see the triplets, if you're doing like deep house or tropical house or whatever, that's how you would set that up. And then dotted, same thing. You will not see the dotted values unless you need them. And I think that's an awesome GUI idea, because a lot of synths have both the triplets and dotted, so it takes forever. Like if I'm just trying to get to like a half note to an eighth note, I'm going to have to hit the quarter note dotted, the quarter note triplet, the quarter note itself, the eighth note dotted, the eighth note triplet, then finally the eighth note. So it's really nice to have that option to turn those off if you're not using them. So let's go over to the right of the rate knob and we'll see this rise knob. And when it's all the way to the left, it'll say off. And when you move it around, it'll either display in time values, but it works the same way as your rate knob does, where if you have the BPM unchecked, it'll now display in seconds. So what this rate knob is doing, the best way to explain it is actually with a real world example. Have you ever wanted to create an LFO that comes in over time? And by that, I mean, you don't want the LFO to maybe just start wobbling right away. Like you want it to happen maybe a second or, a quarter note value after you push or trigger your note value. So then it goes va, 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 right? Well, that's how you can do this. This is essentially telling the output of the LFO how long it takes before you'll start to hear the influence over the sound. So it's a really cool idea. And now let's look at this delay knob. So this is the amount of time before the rise actually begins. So using the rise and the delay, it's a very powerful way to sculpt the time parameters involved when you actually hear the LFO starting to take effect over whatever sources you're modulating. So that's pretty nice. And then this smooth knob, if any of you are users of the LFO tool, you'll be familiar with this. The smooth knob is going to literally smooth out the LFO output. So sometimes with certain shapes, like maybe the sidechain shapes will be, they do in the LFO tool, maybe these will have a little click on them. Let me load up another one real quick. Let's load up sidechain 4. So it's a way to kind of make things a little bit more, depending on how you set it, you'll hear kind of like a click sometimes. And then if you don't want the click, you can set it how you need it. So that's a cool feature for an LFO to have in a synth. I like that. Now let's go back to, let me go to a basic and we'll go to flat 50. Let's actually start talking about drawing some more things in here because there's so many different controls. So again, if you double click, it will add a node or a little dot on the screen, and then you can start dragging around to make your shapes. Now, if you hold down Shift as you move, it will do the step sequencers. It'll move much like a step sequencer. Now, if you hold down, let me go back to 50. If you hold down Alt while you drag and click and drag a point, you'll see that it snaps to the grids. So right now, if I just take this, I'm not holding a key. See how I can get this line in between that grid? Well, now if I hold down Alt, I cannot. So let's look at the Command key will, of course, zero everything out back to default if you need it to. So let me make some shapes here. Draw some of these in. All right, so let's do Alt and Command. If you do Alt and Command, you'll see some colors appear. And what this will allow you to do is allow you to move multiple parts of the synth that's colored in relation to themselves. So that's a nice touch, actually. And then you can, of course, control click and select different shapes to make it move in certain ways. So ramp up, ramp down. You can set your start point to when the LFO starts. See how that little S appeared. So there's just a host of things that you can do inside this visual editor, which are really awesome for sound design. All right, so that pretty much covers the envelopes and LFOs inside of Serum. We will be going on to the next part of the video where I will be checking out this velocity and note control. I'll see you there.